This is the public policy panel discussion, and we really want to make it a discussion. You know, the government shutdown and the debt ceiling impasse that ended just a week ago, I think brought home to us a lot of things. At least we think that it ended a week ago for now. It really left a perception that government is more dysfunctional than I think most of us can remember. It left the perception that it's impossible to do anything and get even small changes in public policy, let alone address the long list of major challenges that we have: economic, security, social, environmental, and educational challenges. I know that some of the other panels are going to deal with these issues, but we can feel free in this panel to discuss anything that we want to, and we want to engage you. The five of us on this panel have all been one way or another involved with public policy. We entered government to make a difference. We thought we were trained to do that. Many of you followed similar paths. The question for today is, can we really make a difference, and have we really made a difference? With ideology trumping ideas, can the generation that follows us have a chance to make people's lives better? However noble the cause or the hurdles out there to serve, financial and personal sacrifice is really too daunting to make a difference. So we want to engage you today in an open discussion about the future of public service and public policy in America across all that spectrum. Five people here today, I think, are at least qualified to kick off that discussion. On the far right, Elliott Cutler is candidate for governor in the state of Maine. We wish him well in that regard.
But not from the far right.
On my far right, on your left. Elliott is anything but on the far right. Next to Elliott, again on my right, Al Burson.
Everybody's on your right.
Except for Tom. Al Burson, Assistant Secretary of International Affairs and Chief Diplomatic Officer for the Department of Homeland Security. You want to talk about immigration reform? Al's your man. Joyce Peters, again to my right, former Army Judge Advocate General's senior female officer for most of her career, and she was often the first woman to serve in the Army JAG leadership program. Tom Williamson is to my left. Tom's a partner at Covington & Burling in Washington and former solicitor at the Department of Labor. And I'm Dick Berner, and I'm director of the Office of Financial Research, which is part of the Treasury Department in Washington. Our goal is to try to make the financial system stronger. So I want to kick things off today by maybe talking about something I just alluded to, and Al and I were talking about that downstairs, something that's really important for the country, and that Al and I feel optimistic about, and that's immigration reform. Immigration reform, I'm an economist by training. I look at immigration reform as a huge positive for our economy, for the North American economy. And as I said, no one's better qualified to talk about that than Al, but a lot of you, I think, we want to engage you in the discussion about that subject. So why don't we kick it off with that, and maybe Al, maybe say a couple of things about immigration reform that make you optimistic.
Yeah, let me start, though, Dick, with what the discussion that led to this idea that we really wanted to have an open forum and not a description of what any of the five of us have done in public policy, which is the notion that, having come through the last month in Washington, people throw up their hands and say, boy, the government is dysfunctional, the country doesn't have a chance, that the constellation of political forces is such that our best days are behind us. And I would argue not only that it's likely that we will have immigration reform, but that this is something that comes around once every generation, that it is in the nature of public policy in this country that things don't come easily. In fact, that's the way the framers designed it. It is not a system designed to move quickly or to accomplish big things in short times. In terms of the dysfunction of the country, I would remind us of the world we left college in 45 years ago, a country that was ripped apart by the Vietnam War and completely torn by the civil rights movement. And think about where we stand a generation and a half later. So on the immigration reform, it actually is more likely than not, oddly enough, because of the dynamics within the Republican Party, that there will be a series of bills passed by the House. In fact, 2 or 3 of them have already been passed, having to do with border security and fixing the so-called legal immigration system. And I think the point is that you have to stick to it, and you have to see these battles through. I look at Dave Vitale. Dave and I crossed in the public education realm. He just finished the toughest negotiation with the teachers union in Chicago. Public education is something that 30 years from now, we will actually have very significantly closed the achievement gap in this country, but it's going to take another generation. So let me just say I am an optimist about immigration reform, because I think it is this time we haven't had serious immigration reform in this country since 1986. Ronald Reagan signed the last significant immigration reform. That's a generation ago. So the general proposition is that these great changes in our history take a considerable amount of time to accomplish, and I'm not terribly pessimistic because of this last bruising battle that we've been through. I mean, it was ugly and it was stupid, but it's not completely atypical in terms of American history. So let me stop there, Dick.
Tom Reston, I see you in the room. You're writing a book about the Democratic myth, and that obviously has a lot to do with politics. Do you have any comments about the last month that we've been through here, and set it in historical perspective for us related to what Al just said?
I was planning to ask him a question about immigration. Which
Thought we'd grab you first.
Interests me. Let me ask my immigration question first. I've been involved with the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, MALDA, for decades and decades. I'm interested in whether you think the White House is really going to stick with this immigration reform. There is a significant number of Latino groups who are quite responsive to the views of the White House, who are saying, look, it's too difficult. Let's just pin it all on the Republicans, say that we can't get it done because they're impossible, make a lot of hay out of it during the election campaign, and then we'll try again. Is the White House really going to try to get something, or is the White House going to, play the game?
So the question, Tom Sines shows how long in the tooth we're getting, Tom. He was an associate in the law firm I started in California in the 70s.
He's terrific.
There are a fair number of political calculations in the West Wing that would say that, but I don't believe that's where the president is. I think the tough issue for the president is going to be, do you give up the path to citizenship? See, the four legs of this table are border security, employer verification to really dry up the job magnets so that we don't attract people with the hypocrisy of wanting secure borders and cheap labor at the same time. The third is making the legal system, visa system work, and the fourth is the path to citizenship. And the path to citizenship is something that the president is committed to, and right now the party line, which I'm following, is that a bill that did not have a path to citizenship would not be acceptable. But here's the counter argument on this goes something like this, Tom. We have 11 million people. After Ronald Reagan signed the '86 bill, we 11 million people have come into this country illegally, a bipartisan disgrace at the doorstep of both parties, and we need to provide a legal status so that people can work, so that they can actually report crimes, so that they can avoid exploitation in the labor market. And the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Goodlatte, has proposed a bill that would provide provisional legal status. And the difference with the Gang of Eight, the White House-supported bill, is that it would not provide, it would provide for green card status, long-term permanent residence, and a path to citizenship under the current law. It's the Democratic position that it's the inadequacies of those routes that we need to fix, and with 11 million people, you would not be able to provide, the system could not handle that number under the existing statute. My personal position, not the position of the government, is that the key is provisional legal status. And if the Republicans want to be so silly as to hand Democrats the cudgel of second-class citizenship, then they will go ahead and do it. But the fact of the matter is, under the Gang of Eight, under the Schumer-McCain bill, it took almost 15 years for someone to get citizenship anyway. The imperative is that we get people out of the underground. So I think there will be a bill. I think it'll be conferenceable. I think Dick and I talked about, I think it'll happen by the first half of 14. But I warn all of you, as my wife and friend Lisa says, he's often wrong but never uncertain.
Maybe, I see Max Keeney in the room. Max lives in New Mexico and has most of his life. I went to Max's wedding in New Mexico, and he tried to teach us city slickers how to be cowboys. And Max comes from a border state. I'm just wondering, Max, if you have any things that you want to share with us about this particular issue, living in a state which is right on the front lines of some of this debate.
Well, thank you for mentioning my wedding. I'm still married, by the way.
44 years later, and happily so.
She's with me today, and Al Burson was at that same wedding, and Carter Lord was at that same wedding. So we've had a little bit of influence. I'll quote what my father's attitude is. We need the labor that Mexico has to provide to this country, and they need our intellectual and other resources from the United States. His attitude would be try to get them to live together in a closer manner than what they do now. I don't know if I answered your question or not.
But I think that points to something that's important between us and the U.S. and the Mexican economies, which is that the trade between us and Mexico is flourishing. It's growing even stronger. U.S. companies are investing in Mexico. Mexicans want to invest in the United States. Mexico is really becoming and has the potential to be an economic powerhouse. And that's going to make North America a much stronger economy as a unit. And if we can fix the immigration problem, then that's going to really help cement that trend. So I think that's important.
A footnote, and then I'll quiet down. So half of the people, 60% of the people that we now arrest on the Texas border are not Mexican. The trend is the Central American, for the most part, Salvadorian, Guatemalan, Honduran, and that's a long-term trend. That isn't going to change. Mexico is a powerhouse. 13th largest economy in the world, and the OECD predicts that in one generation, by 2042, it'll have a larger economy than Germany, which is the fourth largest economy. Mexico is a key to our future, which is another reason why the immigration reform is such a crucial dimension of the continuing American success.
Elliot, you're involved in state and local politics, and I think there's a perception out there that we've gerrymandered our states into such balkanized territories that, it's really polarized the way our elections are run, and it's really kind of rigged in some ways, the election outcomes. Do you want to give us some perceptions about some of the challenges in that arena as well as others in the local or state political area?
Well, sure, like Alan, I'll start with some perspective. But let me say first, to answer your question directly, gerrymandering has been a problem, but I think it's of two problems the lesser. I think it's a much less important problem than money. And I want to come back to that point in a minute. I've had two political careers. One was right after leaving college when I went to work for Ed Muskie and spent 7 years working for him, helping to write the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and NEPA and other of the foundational environmental laws, and then 3 years in the White House under Carter helping to run the Office of Management and Budget. And then when my record in presidential elections got to be 1 and 4,
It's good in baseball.
I quit politics and left politics for 25 years and built a law firm and practiced law. I'd lived in China for 3 years, moved back to Maine in the process. And it was probably the consequence of living in China for 3 years and moving back to Maine that brought me up short and led me back into politics. And I ran for governor in 2010, lost by 9,000 votes, and running again, this time, both times as an independent. When I worked for Ed Muskie and when we were writing the Clean Air Act, Muskie's closest allies in that effort, and the Clean Air Act, incidentally, has probably been one of the most successful pieces of legislation enacted in the United States in the last half century. The cost-benefit ratio is about 1 to 30. Millions and millions of Americans benefited from it. It's responsible for everything from higher mileage in your cars to lower emissions rates in American industries and cleaner air by 60%. His closest collaborators in 1969-70 were Caleb Boggs and Howard Baker. Caleb Boggs was a Republican from Delaware. Howard Baker was a Republican from Tennessee who later became the Senate Majority Leader and then became Chief of Staff under Reagan. And in those days, Democrats ran the gamut from Stennis and Eastland from Mississippi and Muskie and Pastore and Warren Magnuson on the other side of the fence, and Republicans ran the gamut from Goldwater to Rockefeller. So the Venn diagram looked like this. And things got done, and they got done by men and women of principle working together. Different principles, but working together. Now, to go back to your point, ideology has trumped, not ideas so much, there are a lot of ideas out there. Ideology has trumped principle, and it's trumped collaboration. And so the consequence of that is not only what you see in the behavior of our elected officials and the failure to collaborate, but much more importantly, the consequence is that we have a larger gap in America in incomes, in social mobility, and in opportunity than any time in American history. And we're at a point, and you've probably all heard some of these statistics before, but 400 people in the United States control more wealth than the poorest 150 million combined. 93% of the income gains in 2009 and 2010 after the crash went to the top 1% of American taxpayers. The federal government spends 4 times as much money on housing assistance for the top 20% of us than it does on subsidized housing for the poorest among us. You go on and on and on. In the state of Maine, 1 in 12 people live lives of really grinding poverty, and 1 in 4 kids are hungry. This is not a country that our parents or our grandparents would recognize or be proud of. So why has this happened? Well, I think money has an awful lot to do with it, and I'm talking about money in politics. When Muskie ran for president in 1972, and I was in charge of scheduling in advance, if we had to send someone out on the road to set up, as we called them, stops, the campaign manager would, Burl Barnhart, who Tom knows, Burl would sit in his office, he'd turn around, he'd open a safe, and he'd pull out a wad of cash. That was the currency, it was cash. Today, the currency is not cash, it's checks and wire deposits in hundreds of millions of dollars. In 1974, a total of $77 million was spent on all Senate and House races combined. In 2010, $1.8 billion was spent. That's a 552% real increase. Real, not real. In 1966, which was the year before I went to work for Muskie, 21% of all eligible voters in the United States, everyone over the age of 21, not just registered, 21% voted in Democratic primaries. In 2010, 8% voted in Democratic primaries, and you can see the same thing happening in the Republican Party. In 1964, 70% of the American people believed that you could trust the government of the United States to do the right thing all or most of the time. And today that number in the same poll is below 10%. The parties have migrated to where the money is. It's the same reason why Jesse James robbed banks. And as they've migrated to the left and to the right and become smaller and narrower, they've left most of us bereft. In Maine, in 2012, in primaries for an open U.S. Senate seat, which happens once in a dog's age, an open U.S. Senate seat, the two parties nominated each a candidate. Those two candidates were nominated with less than 5% of the registered voters of the state of Maine voting for them. And of course, the Senate seat was won by an independent. So both parties, sure, the Democratic Party's behaved better in the last 6 months than the Republican Party. Both parties have permitted ideology and very narrow dogma to trump principle and collaboration. And the consequence is an America that's in real trouble. Gerrymandering, slowly getting fixed, principally by judicial commissions. It's going to be better 20 years from now than it is today, I think. But money in politics, until we fix Citizens United, which I happen to think was the worst Supreme Court decision probably since Dred Scott, money in politics is really a burden that's tying our hands.
Why don't we take some questions around the table before we move on to other consequential issues? Any of you guys want to weigh in on this? Yes.
Elliot, I've seen some places where it's stated that only about 125 congressional seats are really contested, and partly because of gerrymandering. And actually, one of the worst states is Massachusetts, where a lot of races were uncontested. Could you mention about the new law they're trying in California?
Open primaries.
To get around the gerrymandering?
Yeah. Thanks. That's a good question. It doesn't entirely get around gerrymandering, but it helps. And the law in California and Washington are the only two states in America today that have open primaries. It's newer in California, I think, than it is in Washington. And the consequence in California has been dramatic because the California legislature, which is now made up of members who have been elected in an open primary for the first time, open primary system, where, everybody runs in a primary and the two highest vote getters have a runoff. The California legislature is now extraordinarily centrist. And they're actually doing things that they never were able to do before, like enact budgets. And it's a remarkable, though not surprising, development. I've been pushing for either an open primary or a runoff or ranked choice voting in the state of Maine for 5 years. Both parties don't want it. Guess why?
Just as a code of that, I have never understood the ranked system.
Ranked choice?
Yeah, the ranked choice system. It was a disaster in Oakland, California, an admitted disaster, because people didn't understand it and clearly still do not. And so I think until people really understand the mechanics of how that really works and how you can end up with someone as incompetent as we've ended up with, and not just in.
But she had it coming.
And I hate to say that about a woman, and there aren't enough women on this panel, incidentally. But the fact is, it's these various systems, and Janice Cooper is a very close friend of mine, and she's in favor of ranked voting and so on in Maine. And I think that a lot of these systems, we don't know how they really work, and we end up with sort of a situation that no one intended. And so I just have some hesitancy in that.
Seriously, I understand the risk. I think I can't speak for Oakland. We have smarter people in Maine. Because
We're going down a path, I'm not sure I wanna
in
follow.
Portland, we had ranked choice voting. We have ranked choice voting now, and we had it in the mayor's race. And it was a huge success, both in terms of, the right person winning, arguably, but also in terms of the level of participation, which is one of the big problems we have everywhere in America, and the excitement people had, and the consequence it had for the tone of the campaign was amazing, because in ranked choice voting, you are, if you're a candidate, you're highly constrained against negative personal attacks. There was none of that, because when you do it, you get number 15 instead of number 2 or 3 or 1. So, look, I mean, I'm sort of indifferent. Runoff, open primary, ranked choice voting, anything that permits more participation, encourages more participation, and less dominance of highly ideological, narrow agenda-driven money to dominate our system is a plus.
Joyce, I wanted to come to talk a little bit about the military in particular, because when we graduated college, and all of you hark back to the last couple of years we were in college, we were in the midst of, as Al and Elliot both mentioned, a war that many of us were not in favor of, a war that really tore the country apart in some ways, and that changed, I think, our perception of where public service began, service of our country in the military. It used to be something that was quite different from what it is today. I'm wondering what your perspective is on the role of the military in public service, and how we should look at it as, a part of our defense system, one that really we need to serve our country and the world for that matter, since we're still the dominant power, but one that really has evolved in ways that we don't fully understand.
I think it's very interesting that while we were here at Harvard, the ROTC program folded. And it was only a few years ago that the ROTC program started to be brought back to universities, but it was all surrounded by the gay issue was a big part of it, because they wouldn't put an ROTC unit in a school if they had an anti-gay policy. Yale put its ROTC program back into place before Harvard did, but Harvard's got its ROTC program back, and I think they work together with MIT at this point. But having been inside the military, and I will have to say, people can talk about having a great desire for public service. Frankly, when I went in the military because I was marrying a man who had an Army commitment. And I was coming out of law school, and I wanted to practice law. So when I started in the military, there were 10 women in the Army JAG Corps, and so there weren't many of us. And when I got inside the Army JAG Corps, I realized that the Army really didn't know quite what to do with the women that it had. And in fact, the very first man that I worked for, I'm going to lay this as background so you get an idea of what I'm talking about. They actually asked him if he would take a woman in his office, and his response to them was, yes, I will, as long as you don't tell me how I will use her in my office, which was actually very smart. He put me in the courtroom immediately, so I became a prosecutor immediately, which gave me instant credibility in the entire command, made me sought after. I was pretty good at trial skills, which didn't hurt, and I realized that almost from the beginning that everywhere I went, everybody looked at me. And so if I sneezed, they figured all women sneezed. And so I had to be successful in everything I did. So I was successful in this job, and I was selected out of that to go to the graduate course in Charlottesville, which is where the Army's legal school is located. It's a huge school now, it's a huge operation. And I was the first woman in resident in that class, and I was the distinguished graduate. And when I went up to get my diploma, they now get an LLM from that school. They did, when I was there, of course, I was a day early on that. The women in the class, none of whom were students in the class, they were all wives or other people in the community, all stood up and cheered. So the idea was that they were really happy to see a woman be successful. I liked it. I liked what I did. I had a great deal of satisfaction in what I did, and so I stayed for 22 years. And I did do a lot of things in the policy realm, and probably, I would say the biggest impact I had in my time in the military, and I didn't make general officer, and that could have made a difference, but they weren't really prepared to have a general officer woman at the time. I was long retired before they got the first one, and now a woman has finally achieved the position of the Judge Advocate General of the Army. She's a 3-star general. She's just been sworn in. I've met her. She's a terrific woman. I'm just really pleased because we have another person that can kind of carry the torch. But during the entire time that I was in the military, the policies on women and the policies on who could serve and how they would serve were evolving. And I had a big role in this because I participated not only in kind of influencing how the lawyers were being treated in the military, but I sat on the first women in military service committees, and was engaged at the policy level on how should women be integrated into the forces, how should they be used, should they in fact have the same kinds of jobs. And one of the problems for the military is it's very structured. Maybe that's not a problem, maybe that's a strength also. Because if you send a unit into combat, everybody in the unit has a specific function. And so they all know what their function is, they're trained for that function. When you pick up the unit and you move it, you know you get this entire set of skills to do a particular task. So that's good. The problem for the women was that there were statutes in place that prohibited women from serving in combat or women serving in certain jobs. So the Army was very hard trying to integrate women into service. And so they were putting them into new kinds of positions. And what would happen is that, this was particularly true for enlisted women, but it also happened for officers. They would progress up the chain to a certain point and they'd hit the ceiling. And they couldn't go to the next job that would be in that career progression. So what they did is they lateraled them. And so they said, well, this is fine. They're being treated equally. And my position always was, no, that's not equal. Because what happens is when you lateral them, they're not competitive at that point with the people that have come up in that train. So the Army has been grappling with this kind of stuff for a long time. And I will say that there's a great deal of pride in the people that serve in the military. And regardless of what the Vietnam War feelings might have been in the 60s, that is not the feeling that you generally get in military units now. There's a great deal of pride. There's a great sense of purpose. There's a great sense of idealism in this service. But what's happening, and what I see happening, is that with this endless war situation we have that was not very well thought out at the beginning because there was no exit plan, the members of the armed forces now are being deployed over and over and over again. And each time there's a deployment, nobody expects to come home other than the way they went over, but some do. It's been very hard on the families of the service members. It's caused terrible deprivation for some of the families, and it's also resulted in a lot of the reserve component being activated to do things. And it's like if Alan were a reservist, and tomorrow we said, we want you to go, and you would have to say yes because he'd signed up to go. So he'd have to close down everything he's going, and his family that may have been living on, pick a number, $150,000 a year, is suddenly going to live on the pay of whatever grade he's in the service. It's been kind of catastrophic, had sort of kind of catastrophic effects to the extent that this has had to happen. Now, people know this when they sign up, but they don't really expect it to impact them like that. I saw something yesterday that was on the news from the comptroller of the military that said it cost the military $600 million for the government to be closed. But the real cost to the military from this kind of activity is not so much the dollars and cents, although that's obviously important, but the military is a different kind of animal. It's not a Department of HEW, Department of Veterans Affairs. It's not a civilian organization. This is an organization where the relationships among the people and the personal relationships and the commitment and the drive and the need to be part of something is there. And when your political leaders say, we don't care about you, the impact on morale and the impact on the ability of the services to recruit the kind of people that they want and to keep the forces filled up, and also to kind of balance out the need to have people going on these deployments is really hurt. And his comment was, it may have been $600 million in cost, but the real cost of the armed services is far greater, and it's very hard to measure because of that. So, I mean, I think that it's one thing to talk about all the political gains and the political issues and public policy and how you deal with public policy, but in the military context, it's very important to pay attention to what the entity is that you're dealing with, because it's really very different from private sector. And I was in the military 22 years. I know a lot about the military. I spent 5 years at the Justice Department, and I greatly recognize the difference between the military and the Justice Department, because you go to a meeting in the military, and you would have a meeting, and at the end of the meeting, everybody would get up, and everybody would walk out, and they know exactly what they were going to do and when they were going to do it by. And I'd go to a meeting at the Justice Department, and we would all get up, we'd all shake hands, and we'd say, fine, we'll see you next Thursday, and we'd have another meeting. So, I mean, and maybe that's important in the Justice Department setting, because you really need to think about, because of the policy and all the things that go on in the Justice Department. But it was eye-opening to me to see a difference in the climate of the two organizations. And then I worked for the bar. I worked for a nonprofit for 5 years. I was the Bar Council enforcing ethics. And that was a policy job of a totally different ilk. And I have to tell you that I have to say that my favorite time was my time in the military, because it really was unique, and it was very fulfilling to see this sort of changing going on. And I think it's still going on. The movement in the military is glacial. The policy changes are very slow. I was talking to Elliot a few minutes ago, and I said I litigated the homosexual policy in the military in Maine, in Portland, I guess it was in the early 70s or late 70s, early 80s. And that was the policy before Don't Ask, Don't Tell. The magistrate was a Harvard person that I knew, and he wrote a 75-page opinion against us. We appealed to the First Circuit, and we overturned it, so the policy stuck. So the change was then moved to Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and that was politically driven. And the issue in the military had never really been so much anti-gay as it was that there were a lot of people in the military who would be difficult to deal with because their own personal views affected how they would relate. And I can remember many times when the commander would call me and say, I have somebody and we're getting ready to board him and he's getting ready to leave, but we're really afraid of him. I said, you got to protect him because he would be a target. And that's a re-education process. So they've changed that, and now the policy is open, which I think is probably where it should have been to begin with, because my feeling is that everybody ought to be able to serve their country. Everybody ought to be able to do this if they can, unless they're physically unable to do it. And so, yeah.
I just saw The Invisible War, which was the single most depressing film I think I've ever seen, about sexual abuse in the military against men and women, but the numbers were staggering, and one after another, these deeply committed women basically said that they would never, ever advise their daughter or any other woman they cared about to ever have anything to do with the military. And yet, with the changes that have started to have been made in this glacial manner that I think you've talked about, still, the idea of not taking that out of the chain of command and really being able to have an impact on it is just such a huge issue.
I think there's more going on than what may have been reported as what is part of that, because when I just heard the Judge Advocate General speak about this, and one of the things that's happening is that they are, the Army is drawing down, and I had asked her, what the structure looked like, how many active lawyers did you have, or how many military lawyers are. I said, well, we have 10,000 lawyers. And I said, no, that's not what I mean. She said, I know what you mean. We have around 1,900, and we're supposed to be drawing down. But they've created a program to put in sexual abuse and sexual crime advocates and prosecutors, and they're trying to get at this issue through the system of changing how the system deals with those kinds of cases to make it different than the way it has been. I know this Navy case has been a big problem, and Gene Fidel and I were talking about this too, about what the future ought to hold to try to deal with this issue, because the problem is you put men and women together and you're going to have issues, and it doesn't fit in a military unit, and there are ways to deal with it, but they haven't necessarily been the most successful ways to do it.
The men thing has been horribly bad for
Yeah, it's all
this
been
time
terrible.
too. But as long as the person you have to go to, or the person, and there is no real incentive within the military to do anything except try to cover those kinds of things.
I think there is an incentive to do other than that.
So it's changing. In
Well,
your favor.
I absolutely, I think it is, and anybody that's been in the military who's had anybody come forward, and I've had that happen. I had it happen when I was at Fort Lewis and I was the chief legal counsel out there. I heard about an allegation by a woman that was made against a dentist. And I thought, oh, a dentist. And she made this allegation against this dentist. And I said, we have to investigate. We have to know exactly what this is all about. And usually my experience had been when you have one person that comes forward and makes an allegation, if you start an investigation, the alligators will all crawl out from underneath the rocks, and you'll suddenly get a different picture of what's going on. And if this is really untrue, it'll also show. And that's exactly what happened. And I lived at that time in Colonel's quarters out in Fort Lewis. And the person behind me was a general dentist, and the guy 2 doors over was a prosthodontist, and I had a children's dentist. I had the executive officer for the commander. And they came to me and they said, this dentist is a fabulous guy. He's going to be a great dentist. He's going to be a general officer in the dental corps. I said, no, he's not. He's gone. He's out of here, because we have the evidence to show that he was doing things he shouldn't have done, and we're not putting up with it. And that's exactly what happened, and he was gone. But every case is different, and people do react differently. So the focus now in the military, from what I can understand, is that they're very focused on this particular issue. And women have always been in that situation because they're relative newcomers to the service, and adapting them into the units has been tricky, and getting them to get equal treatment in promotions, and getting them to get equal standards in physical training, and getting them to have equal training for weapons qualifications and all these things. When I went to Germany in 1972, I went 3 times to draw field gear. They would never give me field gear because they said women don't draw field gear. I said, well, I think I'm going to need some field gear. I'm in Germany, I need some field gear. And I actually never got field gear. And I met later a woman who was a general officer who said that she was in public affairs, and she used to go flying around, and she said the men would all be dressed in field gear with helmets, with their helmets and their special suits, and they would have her flying around high-heeled shoes and bees because that's how women did it. And I said, well, maybe if the helicopter got shot, she wasn't going to get hit. But I think that there is change afoot, and I do think that's an area that definitely needs attention. I think the military is doing that.
Joyce,
Yes.
I'd like to just ask your opinion. In the last couple of months, you might have seen articles by Generals Eikenberry and McChrystal about the issue of greater participation in military. When we were in 1968, there was the draft, and that impacted every man, here. And since we've got rid of the draft, now only 3.25% of our population serve in the military. And you see an increasing number of, sons and daughters of military people. Matter of fact, there's a Veterans Administration ad that's on TV all the time, sort of perpetuating that. McChrystal and Eichenberry were both saying, we need to move towards greater participation, and we need to move towards more integration. For example, why should we have a PX? Why can't they go to Safeway? Why do we have to have on-base housing? We can give them subsidized housing off, but more integration. Because as you know, there's still a feeling of us and them in the military. And there's a feeling sometimes often in the military that sort of, we're better than most civilians because we're, dedicated, honorable, more patriotic, et cetera. What is your feeling on greater participation?
Well, I think the decision was made after Vietnam to go to an all-volunteer force to make sure that everybody that was in the military wanted to be there. And, I think that the services do a tremendous amount of advertising to try to encourage people to come in the service. I think it's a little misleading. I mean, some of it isn't. I mean, it is very much a camaraderie team effort, and a lot of that draws a lot of people. If you really want to have participation, then you'd have to have some kind of forced federal, service, some kind of service obligation. I'm not sure the country's prepared to do that. I think that the more of the leadership of the government who have had some military service in some way, the better off, because the military is unique in a lot of ways, and they don't appreciate what it's like when the political branch says to you, go fight. Go do this. I mean, because that's what the military is. The military isn't making those decisions. The political branch is making those decisions. But I do think that it's important for people to be committed to be in the service. And I do think that there was having the draft and having a lot of people that we had to eliminate after Vietnam who were there because they were drafted and didn't want to be there. And we had a lot of people who were brought into the service who were not mentally qualified, which was a terrible problem too. This happened in the early 70s when I was initially doing my court-martial work. But I think the broader participation would be good for the community, but I'm not sure there's a way to do that without an enforced service, and I'm not sure I would favor that. I think that having people in there as volunteers has been working very well, and the military is having really no real problem in reaching its goals and doing that. So I don't know. They haven't proposed anything as to how to do it, but that's my view.
Policymakers. The number of policymakers in Congress that have been served in the military has dropped from like 37% down to 12%
Yeah, it's
now.
very small. It's
And
very small.
it will decrease even
Yeah,
further.
the John McCain's of the world and the people that have got real service, they're just not there.
Actually, there are several Harvard veterans who are, a couple are in the Senate and House, and others are running. Tom Cotton's a good example. And, but I just, a point of context, on campus right now, at our graduate level, we have approximately 250 veterans and active duty military who are here at Harvard on assignment. They're at the graduate school, B-School, Kennedy School, Law School. Law School has approximately 30 veterans, probably 3 or 4 active duty. So there is, in fact, a very robust military presence on campus. These are mostly multi-tour Iraq Afghan people, mostly officers, captain up in the lieutenant colonel category. And it's created a lot of very positive interaction on campus. And Drew Faust has been terrific, not only in the ROTC readmission on campus. However, it is a very small program. Right now, all 4 grades, all branches, it's only 30 people. And it is still run out of MIT, although they have offices for the Navy and Army on campus. But she has been terrific in all phases of support of military on campus.
I think the GI Bill is one of the biggest selling points for the military for a lot of young people coming into the military, and it's a huge program, and I'm sure that some of these people that are here are, using theirs. Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
There was another question over on this side of the room, I think? No? Maybe not? Tom Williamson, we've all talked a little bit before this panel, and Al and Elliot alluded to it about equality and inequality. Joyce talked a little bit about that in the military. my way of thinking, it's one of the biggest social and economic problems we face in America today. And as a lawyer who's worked in this area, what's your perspective on what the law can do, what policy can do to help alleviate this issue?
Well, it's a daunting challenge that I don't think our generation anticipated. In part because of something I think we all experience with our own kids, that whatever the deal is when you're a kid, you sort of think that's normal, and that's the way the society will work. You know, we were born right after World War II, and the country was rebuilding and growing and focusing on peacetime, and everybody was supposed to be able to do better than their parents. But when we look at what's going on now, it's something that my former boss when I was at the Labor Department has talked about a lot, this enormous gap that is growing between the haves and the have-nots. It's very alarming. I think in some ways we feel that changes that many of us supported or celebrated would check or control this trend. The civil rights movement, raising the minimum wage, trying to enforce the Fair Labor Standards Act more aggressively. But when you look at the statistics and the reality, those are being trumped by these trends where we have a very small percentage of people, populated by most of us and our children, who are getting way ahead, sort of exponentially ahead of the rest of the society. And to tell you the truth, I don't really see encouraging trends. At a micro level, I've got a 17-year-old who's taking an SAT practice exam today. And she's been tutored for the last 2 or 3 years in SAT and SACT. We're, her mother and I, we're loving, caring parents. But I'm saying, wasn't it better when the deal was bring 2 number 2 pencils and show up on Saturday? In terms of real equality and opportunity, how can, 90% of the kids in the country fairly compete with that 10% that gets to do that? Now, I see Dave nodding there. I also with the public schools, really, I think important institution as we were growing up. And again, it seems like we're just growing apart. When I came to school here at Harvard, I was very proud that in our class, I believe was the first class, where a majority of the class came from public schools. Thought that was a really cool thing. And I think there are people of goodwill in the law, and there are tools to chip away at the margins. But personally, I'm very concerned that there are these kind of overwhelming demographic and they're class separation trends. Some things in the racial area are much better, although there are quite a few disparities that are worse. That's a whole area that I think we thought that'll be behind us by the time we come to our 45th or 50th. That's not true, but an even deeper problem that gets felt disproportionately in the black community is this class gap where very, very small percentage of our society doing well. And as I said, I think our generation really thought, no, we are into equality and justice, and as we proceed in our lives, we will become the ones who build a fairer, more open society. And I think to the extent you care about this and you recognize this problem, it's important to be trying to raise the consciousness of your own children and of professional colleagues that as comfortable as life may seem, there are huge challenges that we're not aggressively facing as we should. And then, I don't think you should put too much weight on the Supreme Court, although, again, I think we grew up in a very unusual time in the history of the country. The Supreme Court was a cutting-edge progressive institution. That's not really representative of the Supreme Court's history. And people need to take that into account, and also trying to, I do this, I still do pro bono cases, but like I had a case against the U.S. Postal Service where we represented deaf employees who back in 2001, early 2002, were not being given warnings about what was the dangerous stuff that was being sent through the mail, the anthrax. And they didn't have adequate interpreters. And, I've said, man, this is going to be a laydown. And we're going to really look great coming in and representing. We're going to say, we'll do it as a nationwide class action. Well, we eventually got a very favorable settlement, but we filed the case in 2002, and the settlement wasn't approved by the judge until July 31 of this year. So that's, you try to do those things, but I don't think it's a very efficient way to go at it. I see it as a much larger sort of social problem and challenge than what lawyers do or what the legal system offers.
So Dick, let me ask, I don't think there's a thing that Tom said or that Elliot said earlier that I disagree with, but the idea that the trend is projected out, and when I listen to Joyce talk about the change that took place in the military, and think about the change that took place from the 70s to today.
Absolutely.
The question I'd ask to Tom and Elliot and all of us is, are the dimensions that make change in America that have led to change over time, and as I indicated, I'm used to it being very slow and glacial. Glacial is the way it happens. Whether or not those dimensions that typically have righted the American ship of state, so to speak, whether those are fundamentally different now, such that we shouldn't expect generational change. I'm not so clear on that.
You want to start?
I would say, Alan, what's disturbing to me is that, when you said, geez, when we came out of college, think about how torn apart the society was. And actually, I remember when another government position I had was the Deputy Inspector General of what was then the newly formed Department of Energy, when Jim Schlesinger was the first secretary. And when I interviewed with him, he said, geez, I thought you people just wanted to tear down the system in the country. Why are you here asking if, I'm going to sign off on your being offered up as a presidential appointee? I said, no. We were frustrated when we were in college because we wanted to make this system right, but we knew we were too young to get the positions to do that. Now we are old enough, so you should give us these positions, and we'll take care of business. And I think our generation had this sense we're all in it together, and we want to live up to the ideals that we were taught coming, with our parents coming out of World War II. I worry, Alan, now that there are various ways that we're being polarized. I mean, everybody knows about this with how, like for some of the craziness that went with the government shutdown, maybe this is naive, but I think a Walter Cronkite could have said, America, this is ridiculous. And everybody said, yeah, that's crazy. And it just wouldn't have happened. And now we know we don't have a voice like that anymore. There are some downsides to having that much concentration in the networks, but what has replaced it, I think, is a type of polarization in the way we communicate, the way we learn, and literally the way wealth is apportioned that gives me pause about whether what has worked in the past is going to sustain us through this current bump so that we find the right place to get to.
Maybe you go next and I'll come.
Yeah, let me tell you all a story about a town in Maine called Dover Foxcroft. There are a lot of towns in Maine across rivers. This is the only two towns in Maine that merged and formed one. They did it after 120 years of being separate. And every year in the town meeting in both towns, on the warrant would be the question, should Dover and Foxcroft merge? And every year it got voted down until 1922. And in 1922, it passed overwhelmingly in both towns. Does anybody here know why? Right. Women got, I knew you'd have that, Druzy. Women got the vote. And they said, they looked at this and they said, this is stupid. I was in Dover Foxcroft about, I don't know, a few months ago. And a fellow about our age, now the term about our age has extended as we've gotten older. But a fellow about our age came up to me and he said, Elliot, when our parents came home from fighting World War II, they went out and invested. They built roads and bridges and educational systems, and they invested. And they didn't come to us when we were 3 years old and say, is this the right thing to do? They just went out and did it. And then he looked at me, and he's a Mainer. He looked at me and he said, so what are we doing for our kids? Which is a very good question. And if you look at investment over the course of our maturity, and you look at the taxation over the course of our maturity, and you look at the consequences of non-investment in educational systems, in public education, over the course of our maturity, it's awful. It is embarrassing, and the consequences are exactly what Tom and I were talking about. And I don't think there's a cure for that other than investment. And what we have in America today, for a lot of the reasons that Tom was describing, and some of which that I described, is not a NIMBY problem, not in my backyard. We have a NIM2 problem, which stands for not in my term of office. And it's a serious, serious problem. And the only way we're going to fix it is through some kind, I think, of quiet, well, the camera's on me, I can't say it. I'd like to see more activism of the sort in which I'm engaged among the members of our generation, because I think we can still fix it.
Let me pick up on that for just a minute, but why don't you guys go ahead and I'll come back to it.
I'd like to pose a question to all of you a little bit. I'm a little more optimistic than what's going on up front there. And I think maybe one of the reasons, during the 70s and 80s, early 90s, I had spent a lot of time in Washington in the work that I was doing. But in the last 15 years, I don't spend very much time in Washington. But I've been paddling in the waters of policy at the local and state and regional. And to me, there's an awful lot more going on that's productive and moving things forward, not solutions that solve everything, but progress at the local and state and regional level. By the way, I chaired ISOM Unit for years. What do you think about Washington versus state? And local?
Too easy.
Yeah, not close.
Too easy. You win.
No, I mean, I think, look, I'm optimistic too, otherwise I wouldn't be doing this a second time. And I'm very optimistic. I mean, Maine is a state, as you know, with assets that every state in America would love to have. It's the best. I've done turnarounds. This is the best turnaround opportunity I've ever seen. But, and it's a big but, the states and towns and cities around America that are successful are those that have, to one degree or another, taken their uniforms off and identified their competitive advantages, invested in them, and broken away from the kind of deeply partisan ideological politics that has seized up Washington and has seized up Augusta, Maine.
One of the things that I see going on, I'll just comment on this and come back, at the municipal level and sometimes at the state level, the problems that we all talk about, big, messy problems healthcare, longevity, retirement saving, some of the long-term challenges we face here. Politicians at the local level are right up front with those problems. One of the problems with Washington, even in what I do, is that Washington can be removed from confronting those problems directly. And when you're looking,
They are.
what's that?
For those of us who work for local, they are removed.
In my neck of the woods, we face it every day, I can assure you. But the fact is that when you're facing it right up front, and the immediacy of that confrontation really forces you, whatever side of the political aisle you're on, to deal with it right away. So Elliot cited the example of Dover Foxcroft. It was absolutely the fact that sensible women came in and got the thing done. But it was also the fact that economic reality intruded and said, there's no other way. I spent a lot of time in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh and Allegheny County is a county with 1 million souls. I lived there for 7 years. It had 132 municipalities, at one point each with its own school district, its own fire department, its own police department. You can do the math and figure out that that really doesn't work for the tax base or for the duplication of effort. So they started to learn, reluctantly, that consolidation and exploiting the economies of scale, especially with technology today, made some sense. And they're continuing to do some of that. And if they're starting to recover in economic terms, it's because they're starting to take advantage of those trends that are forcing them in economic terms to come to grips with them. Same thing that's happening. I mean, you look at other areas, some of the governors at the state level who've been successful, as I think many of us hope Elliott will be, have been successful because they've been able to marshal those forces and turn them and make people focus on them and realize that change has to happen. So I think that's one of the big differences that is out there. It comes slowly to Washington, but one of the reasons I went is to bring it to Washington because I think it needs to happen. There was a question here. Marshall. Sorry.
I think I need a dose of optimism. I understand the economic force argument, but I see something on the other side that causes me great pessimism. And that is...
I thought you were going to say you're optimistic.
No,
He needs it from us
looking
because he's not going
It's
to.
you. And it's this. I see culture and race superseding a lot of the economic forces. And I'm talking about, I saw inequality for all. And there happened to be a Q&A with Reich afterwards. And I kept thinking about what's the matter with Kansas, where you have people voting against their economic self-interest. And the only way to really explain it is culture. Their cultural biases trump everything. And I've seen that unleashed the last several years to the point where people are just blinded by either cultural anxiety, racism, really almost, no, not almost, it's ugly. But it fractures the society. And I'd like to hear from, let me also say, I'm around a lot of young people now, and I'm very heartened by that. Yeah. It's wonderful. But I think we also were similar to them. And I don't think they'll change. I really have great faith in them and the way they interact. But till we get to a point where they are dominant, I'm not sure if that point will come. It's going to be a while in any event. But I'd like to hear what you have to say about these cultural, racial forces going on that seem to be tamping down our overall opportunity for progress as a society.
There was maybe one of Al?
Yeah, I was actually going to make a comment, almost the reverse of that in terms of where I see some trends going. To Tom's point earlier, that when you
you know, when you're in the middle of trying to make change, it always seems like it's taking forever and nothing's easy. But when you look at the degree to which racial, gender, sexual orientation issues have advanced and overcome, you know, the culture war of social left, social right, you know, that all of us took as the daily currency of politics until pretty recently. I mean, those things, you know, due in large part, you know, to our kids' generation, you know, have changed, relatively speaking, you know, however incompletely, rapidly, and we can see that happening. And the degree to which, you know, income and opportunity inequality is getting worse. And I think all of us who may feel optimistic about other stuff can't help but feeling more pessimistic, I should do, about that than I have in a long time. You know, it's always been true, you know, that the social left-right dimension and the economic left-right dimension are, you know, they overlap, they intersect, but they're never the same, you know, which is you know, what's wrong with Kansas is about. But I, you know, we had 16 years of Republican governors in this state, the nuclear winter as it was known to some of us, and the, you know, but the overall theme of their success all that time, including Mitt Romney when he ran here, was the everyday Massachusetts cliche of socially liberal, fiscally conservative. And, you know, if you're a presentable-looking, youngish Republican, you know, you can get elected governor, you know, saying that stuff tomorrow, and Charlie Baker may. And you know, I see more of the country being that way. So I actually feel, you know, reasonably good about where the social stuff is going. I mean, you know, there are lots of different social views in America, you know, and folks will never agree with me and I'll never agree with them. But you can see, you know, you can see the forces of change having demonstrable success. I just see the income and economic and mobility and equality stuff getting worse, and I don't see the current young generation helping that at all.
Yeah, I mean, in Maine's the whitest, least diverse state in America. But there are two places in Maine where there's sort of a laboratory going on that are really interesting. One is a little coastal town called Millbridge in Washington County, which has the highest per population of Hispanics in Maine, because migrant workers who came to pick blueberries have stayed, and there's a real community. The other is Lewiston, Maine, which is a resettlement area for Somalis principally and other Africans. And what's happening in both places is that when the economy begins expanding, the opportunities that are available to folks expand as well, and people start getting along better, and mobility increases, and incomes increase across the board. Now, when you, and I'm sorry to come back to this point, but when you don't invest and you don't have a plan about how you're going to expand the economy, particularly an economy in the United States where machines are getting more jobs than people, which is our biggest employment problem, I think, right now in America. When opportunities are not expanding but are in many cases shrinking, you've got a real problem. Well, the only cure to that is investment. And until we start investing in this country, we're not going to be able to create those kinds of opportunities, and we're not going to cure the social mobility and income gaps.
And if just one moment of follow-up, the unwillingness to invest in physical and social infrastructure, and you know, and to accept the tax burden of doing so, you know, is I'm in that business, and I couldn't agree more. It's at the very heart of this, and you know, the number of people in our kids' generation who think of themselves as liberal, and if you suggested they weren't, you know, they'd say you're wrong, and if they think they are, who, if you say, how about raising the gas tax a nickel, you know, would blow your brains out, you know, and take it out on you with the polls for even thinking it. I mean, that disconnect is pretty deeply ingrained, I think.
Yeah, and the only way to cure it is to talk about it, which is what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And voters like to be treated like adults, big surprise.
So the fact is you only lost by 9,000 votes, and with a little luck, you're going to win. I just, so nobody's ever accused me of being Dr. Pangloss, that the world is great. I'm not, but
Not lately.
think about the changes that are going on. Think about the Obama winning an election that was supposed to be very close by 5 million votes. For all its problems, what do you think Obamacare is about? But addressing that issue, imperfectly to be sure, but that's, so, we came out of the Roosevelt, we were the last breath of the Roosevelt coalition. We've just come out of 30 years of the market is going to solve every problem. And that's it's slow, but I'm with Dave, not only on the local, I think the young people are voting. I think the way in which the country is developing in terms of the electoral politics. I think the fact that you're a live candidate speaking what you're saying in Maine, which is, a lot more ideologically riven than many states.
See, because believe me, I want to be talked into an optimistic view.
You really need some counseling, Mark.
I know that New England is not like the rest of the country. I did a lot of work in voting rights when I got out of law school and still teach it and get involved in it. You look at the arc of participation of African Americans was awful in the 60s. The Voting Rights Act comes along, and then there's suddenly equal footing. And now, then, not just with the Supreme Court, but you look at what's happened in so many states that are overtly oppressing African American voters. And I see that as just a symptom of some other thinking. I guess I'm not ready to say, and I wish I were, that that progressive thinking is ready to carry the day. I see a huge reaction going on in the country and gaining a lot of influence.
Well, and also with Proposition 209 in California, with the Anti-Affirmative Action Initiative, which then sort of swept in several other states in various forms, the fact is that it worked. It did exactly what the people who passed it, who put it up, wanted to do. The resegregation of public higher education with respect to race has been phenomenally successful for those who wanted that to happen. And right now, if you just look at the profession of law, which is the only thing I know anything about, the fact is that women and people of color are doing worse now than they have been for many years. There's a serious regression back. There are fewer women equity partners. They're decreasing, not increasing in terms of equity partnerships. People of color are not doing better in the law firms when it comes to where the money and the power is. And I think that and this is a state like California, which, although peculiar in many ways, has been very progressive in many ways. And it's so to me, what you say has a lot of resonance to me, and I am really deeply concerned about, particularly the race issue, because I think that what happened with the Voting Rights Act with the Supreme Court, which wasn't any great surprise, but was a disaster. And what's happening across the country in states that are taking advantage of that does not bode very well. And so I think it's not just the sort of the refusal to deal with the economics thing, although I don't think that's what you're saying.
I'm
It's sort of a bad news, good news. I mean, the legal profession is shrinking. Legal profession is shrinking. Law firms are shrinking. And when the pie shrinks, the first people who suffer are, in the case of your example, people of color and women.
Yeah, but it was doing badly with women and people of color before the shrinkage.
But in most cases where the pie grows, there are more opportunities for people who haven't had them before. That's the lesson of every macroeconomic and microeconomic study I've ever seen. And I think it's our failure to focus on growing the pie that's killing us.
Marshall, I'm a little more optimistic, I think, on the racial front anyway. Not so much on the culture piece of what you're talking about, but one, I think race it's a lot more complicated than the way we used to think about racial conflict when we were growing up. And in some ways, the complications are, I think, positive factors. There are people of color who are participating in being in the top 1% or the top 5%. That means that something is going on, or there's a dynamic and a potential that really didn't exist when we were growing up. There are black people, Hispanic people, sitting at tables, participating. I mean, at my firm, the management committee of Covington and Burling, when we were coming up, there was never a person of color who was at the management committee meeting. There are other firms in town where the chair of their managing committee is a person of color. That just didn't exist before. And it's not a solution for everybody, but it suggests there are going to be opportunities for people with different sensibilities to shape how the society works. These days, I'm mainly an employment lawyer, and one of the most, big firm, we represent defendants, employers. One of the most intriguing things to me, Marshall, has been that I think the most aggressive affirmative action in the country is going on in major corporations for a very simple reason. They make projections about, how many talented people are they going to need to continue to be successful. And when they do that, the numbers show there are not enough white guys to make it happen.
Exactly.
It's just as simple as that. And it's not every company, but I think for some of the people in Kansas, they would be a little surprised at the number of Fortune 50 or Fortune 100 corporate leaders who say, you don't get on this program, you aren't moving our diversity agenda, you're not going to have a future here. And I think that's, to me, it's a little surprising that corporate America would have outflanked social activists. But also, corporate America doesn't have the drawback that Washington does. They're performance-driven. So if you don't deliver, you're out of there.
Let me pick up on one thing that Elliot was talking about before. He's said it several times, and that's investment. And I think everybody in this room recognizes that we've underinvested in this economy in education and infrastructure. And those are two crying needs. What Al Rain was saying before as well, but no one wants to pay for it because they don't want to raise taxes. But there's another alternative, because if you think about it from the way that many of us look as economists at what's going on in the economy, we have a misallocation of resources. We've given incentives to people, and with the best of intentions, to provide housing, individual owner-occupied housing for everyone in America. And even Barney Frank, who here at Harvard was my Gov professor, my Gov tutor.
Right.
And mine.
And yours.
Yep.
There you go. And so for me, it was Gov 101, I think. But, and so who I've known a long time. Even Barney Frank would say today, and has said it in public, that not everybody should own his own home or her own home. And the fact of the matter is that that's a misallocation of resources. And we have it within our power to change that. One of the things that I'm involved in, which is financial reform, is directly involved in changing some of those incentives, really so we can reallocate resources away from housing, frankly. Not that people should be denied a roof over their heads. On the contrary, to have more affordable housing, less owner-occupied housing per capita than we've had in the past, and to reallocate those resources.
Go back to the, and I agree with you, but go back to the point that got lost, sort of, one of the points got lost. The United States of America subsidizes by 4 or 5x the top subsidizes housing for the
I'll
top
get to that.
20%. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't want you,
No,
because it's awful.
that's a big piece of it. Elliot is totally right. We have housing subsidies that reward the upper end of the income scale, right? So we have it within our capacity to change those subsidies. And those are things that we need to do to make the right policy choices.
How many here would give up your mortgage deduction. How many still have one?
Mortgage interest deduction. Yeah.
But that's
So
the
so
deal.
that's one choice.
Yeah.
There's another choice.
It's not that goes in there, one day.
Right. There's another choice, and that relates to a more difficult set of choices, and that's in healthcare, because it's also true that we subsidize massively. The healthcare subsidy is far more massive than the housing subsidy. So we made a choice in the past, and the demographics are now, exposing the weakness of that choice to subsidize healthcare and not to pay for it. In other words, try to make our kids pay for it.
Subsidize insurance companies and hospitals.
And in many other ways. And by not counting as income the benefits that are paid to most of us in this room for health care. And so that's another choice. So if we can make those two choices to reallocate resources away from housing and health care and towards education and infrastructure, that's going to be a very powerful tonic for our economy.
I was kind of waiting for that, and well done, and thank you very much, and you kind of ended the question. But let's try you, Governor Cutler.
Yes,
You're in.
Bill.
You won. You won, you're in. One of the ways that you might finance some of the things that
Turn
I
the
think...
TV camera off.
Let's make it generic enough so that it's answerable. You have some idea that you would like to invest in, fair enough, and your choices are to look at more taxes, which is going to have its consequences, or reviewing some of the other things that you've been investing in for years and years and years that may not need to be invested in anymore. How about the ability to say no? Are you going to be able to do that?
Haven, I spent 3 years sitting, as Tom remembers, sitting as Associate Director of the Office of Management and Budget, and all of these guys, not like Tom, but our peers, would come in and they'd say, we want to do this, we want to do that, we want to start a new program, and I was the SOB who said no, and I actually enjoyed it. And there was life after saying no. Now,
But how about for across the board?
in Maine, which is what I know best, we give away in tax expenditures, that is, credits and deductions and so forth, nearly as much as we appropriate in the budget process every year. Backdoor spending. And the difference between the appropriations and the backdoor spending is very simple. It goes on autopilot in the one case and gets reviewed every year in the other. Tax credits and tax deductions get enacted, never get measured for performance, never get evaluated to see if they're doing what they were intended to do, and they go on forever on autopilot. And you got to go in and you got to start taking those down and making intentional, conscious decisions about doing what Dick was just describing, which is allocating resources. If you don't do that, you fail. The second thing you've got to do is you've got to take the tax system and you've got to basically completely restructure it. We have the narrowest sales tax base in Maine of any state in America. And guess what we tax? We tax stuff that poor people buy, as well as rich people. But we don't tax legal services, we don't tax golf course fees, we don't tax lift tickets at our ski areas, we don't tax the things that rich people use. It's regressive. And then we're pushing more and more of our public school budget onto the backs of property taxpayers in communities and towns across the state. And so instead of having equal opportunity between a kid who grows up in Jay, Maine, and a kid who grows up in Cape Elizabeth, where I live, it's highly skewed. And until you make those kinds of intentional, conscious changes in the way you manage a state and allocate resources, you're not going to cure any of this. You're not going to have growth, and you're not going to have equality of opportunity.
All true. Can you make it, can it be made to happen in
Sure,
Washington?
it's a question of leadership, and it's a question of treating voters like adults. It really is. I mean, you know, we, pardon me? Well, it's a huge problem. I mean, with the money and I'll give you an example. In Maine, if you're a Democrat, you can run a coordinated campaign with the Democratic Party And so unlimited amounts of money come into the Democratic Party and get spent on your behalf. And by the way, you have 2 cycles to raise money even though you don't have a primary opponent. Same with the Republican Party. If you're an independent, you can't coordinate with anybody and you get a chance to raise half as much money.
Joe?
Yeah, we'll pull together a couple of points, I think. I think some of the points of change in progression that we've seen in terms of getting individual rights and equality, lack of discrimination, but I think Tom was starting to allude to, well, it's just you get better people when you broaden the base. And so that people now and our generations below us understand that. It's not a question of not sort of, look, this person or this person. There's people that have all kinds of abilities. We need the person with the best ability, and it's really making all of us better off. And
Absolutely.
to the extent that our society becomes like part of it, I'm optimistic, you know. And to the extent that a lot of things we're talking about aren't necessarily like everybody, there's few people in power who keep all these things from changing. There's a structure that's in place. It's, you know, moving on, whether you talk about the off the budget stuff, the things like that is more difficult to change. We've legalized it. It takes a lot of institutional things. And I just think I'm so optimistic about the people that are coming up. You know, when they get to know their values and once they see things, I just really have a lot of hope in it. And I think maybe somewhat pessimism, maybe, you know, where we are on the curve of power right now. We got some top people, top places, and we've all had differences, but we're not the vanguard anymore, put it that way, if you want to change. So I think it can affect our degree of optimism. Thank you.
Others?
One thing, the word invest just drives me nuts. Tax and spend, just stop with everyone talking about investment. Secondly, I don't know about Maine, but I assure you that the money thrown at education is not the problem. I guarantee you that money spent on education in Massachusetts and across the country are multiples relative to inflation for a number of other expenses, driven in good part by the teachers' unions.
Look, in Maine, let me just respond. I mean, I tend to agree with some of the implications, some at least of what you said. I'm number 1 on the NEA's hit list, the National Education Association. Why? Because Maine has the 5th highest spending per capita on education in the country. We have, until 2 years ago, we had teacher tenure after 2 years, no performance rating. I mean, no connection between performance and salaries. Salaries would go on for 20 years in lockstep. We have more teachers per pupil than any state in the country except for Vermont. And Maine used to have a great public education system producing well-educated kids with great performance, and we don't now. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be paying good teachers better. We should. But we don't do it in Maine because the resources are going into other parts of the education system that don't produce results.
Al, do you want to respond to that?
I was going to make the same point. You get around all of these expenditures, budgets represent political constituencies that congealed around a way of doing things. So I was just going to make the same point. You know, Billy Cobb and I have debated this, and Joe, when I was in the education business. The question is how you spend the money.
That's right.
But you don't. It doesn't only apply to the education spending.
Absolutely.
It applies to every one of our budget allocations. And the issue is, you know, do we have political leadership that's willing to actually take the hits? Because every time you take on one of those political constituencies around a spending pattern,
Takes a chunk out.
there's going to be a fight. And you know, the essence of, if there's one thing that I'm worried about is that we don't, and it's passing. We didn't have very good leadership in the 1850s either. And we didn't have very good leadership in the 1920s. Well, from what I gather.
Cal Coolidge.
We don't have the political leadership that's willing to make the right fight at the right time now and know how to pull it off. But that's not that is not something that's a given. You know, and you're in some ways living proof of that with a little luck.
I think that it's fair to say that, you know, the past 5 years in the wake of the financial crisis, where we've had growth in our economy that's averaged 2%, which is well below what most of us who traffic in this business thought as our potential, has also colored our thinking and made us more pessimistic, because it's lowered our horizon for thinking optimistically about what our potential really is. And our potential is actually way beyond that. One of the things we haven't talked about today is what's going on in energy in the United States. Clearly, it's been a problem for 50 or more years, where we've been dependent on foreign sources of energy. We are much less so today, and that's only starting to show up in our economy. The past 5 years in our economy have been colored by the legacy of the financial crisis we went through. The 2% growth rate is something that also has been the result of that crisis, the lingering effects of it. And, a fiscal consolidation, harshest at the state and local level. That was the result of, misplaced policies. As Al said, you got to think about spending the right way, not just how much you spend. A lot of the money that was spent at the state and local level was just not spent in the right way, and so we misallocated resources. And we've gone through painful fiscal consolidation at the state and local level, and there's probably more of that to come. But the fact is that we now have a stronger financial system. That makes me more optimistic. People are paying attention to some of the longer-term challenges that they didn't focus on before. That makes me more optimistic. And I think that, the fact that we do have lots of young people and lots of people from enormously varied ethnicities who are now engaged in trying to solve these problems, that makes me more optimistic as well. Silence.
Stunned us with optimism. What an upper.
Does that make you feel better, Marshall?
Just a footnote on the racial thing also that I've noticed, being in a large law firm, is that, the very thing that many segregationist type people feared is happening. They said that, if we change these laws and allow people of different colors to get together, the white race will be mongrelized by interracial dating and marriage. And now you, as an employer, you actually have to run into problems about how are you going to classify everybody,
right.
Because so many people have embraced mongrelization. And that also, I think, is going to mean like my oldest son is in school in Southern California. He was dating a woman pretty seriously who is part African-American, part Filipino, and part Irish. And he said when he went to their Thanksgiving dinner, it's a very different racial and ethnic conversation than used to be the case when, the black people got together or the white people. And I think for the children coming up, just a lot of the vocabulary and the terminology that we used is just not going to resonate with them.
That's an incredibly important truth.
And so I think that's another, we don't quite know how it's going to play out. And in some ways, when you're not used to it, like I have a term that I sometimes use that is totally politically incorrect, but it's useful for making a distinction and talking about the students at Harvard, where when you look at the numbers that are counted as black or African American, it's pretty consistently 10 or more % of the class. But when you break that down, it turns out there are a lot of African Americans. There are mixed children of mixed races. And there's a group that I sort of thought was, well, this is where I came from. I call regular old Negroes. And my definition of regular old Negroes is both your grandparents were born in the United States. Now, one of the negatives about, I think, where we are racially is that number, which was almost everybody who started, we had 36 black students in our class. Just about everybody fit that category. That number is still about the same number of the students but only about a quarter of the students who are being counted as students of color. So to me, it's positive that the island people, the Caribbean folks, they're different categories, and that's great. But we also should be somewhat concerned that black kids who have grown up in black communities and come from those RON families, I don't think we've made a huge amount of progress.
Well, you see the same thing with Hispanic students, because when you look at the law school statistics, mostly as a result of Proposition 209 and its progeny, but in general, the numbers of Chicanos, of Mexican-American students, and Puerto Rican-American students have dropped precipitously, as well as Native Americans. But the numbers of other Hispanic, which are primarily Cuban-American and some South Americans, have grown. And most of those students have not had the same economic barriers and so forth as the ones that are now comprising the majority of the Hispanic group.
I want to come back to the
question of energy.
I was just going to say, you know, we must live in a different world in Chicago. It's, you know, we have mayors who are nominally Democratic but behave very differently.
I mean, like the current mayor?
Well, and the prior one.
And the prior.
You know, more diatribes against what was going on in Washington regardless of what was there. And who are making, who both made very difficult decisions, kind of decisions you're talking about. And who survive election after election despite making those very difficult decisions. And, you know, I think about the immigration situation. You know, when I moved to Chicago from here, I think there were 70,000 Hispanics in the Chicago metropolitan. Now there are 1,100,000, 1,200,000. So our school system in Chicago is majority Hispanic today.
Wow.
48% Hispanic and only 39, 40% African American. By the way, only 9% Caucasian. And yet, things move ahead. It's, you know, it's challenging. There's lots of conflict to get things to move, but people do make decisions and tough decisions and move ahead. And
Yeah, you know, I was thinking about, I can't remember who made the point, whether it was Alice on this side of the room, but the real challenge is to get voters to vote for their own self-interest or for the collective, larger collective self-interest. And in a time when, as Tom pointed out, the media is so fractured and you listen to what you want to hear. It's hard to do that. But what I found in the first time around was if you treat voters like adults, that is, you're square with them, and you talk about important issues in non-simple terms, and you don't do any negative campaigning, they respond. They listen. I mean, that's what people expect from a political... Andrew Cuomo, I brought this with me. I don't always agree with Andrew Cuomo. But he said something the other day, a few weeks ago, that I thought was right. He said, what politics is about today is a very simple formula. Demonstrate government competence and capacity, that government can actually work, that it can do something efficiently and effectively, that it's not gridlocked, that it's not incompetent. That's not a really high hurdle, or it's not, it shouldn't be. And it's remarkable, there's a lot of truth in that.
You had a question about energy.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to the question of energy. For those of you who are in Washington or who are close to Washington, what are the public policy incentives that you see coming up now to encourage the development of renewable energy?
Well, this is not my area of expertise, but, I don't know if any of us on the panel do.
You're closer to this, but what's driving this is not public policy of Washington, it's technology. It's technological development and innovation that's completely revolutionized the industry. So this is one that, the tax, notwithstanding the tax policies and the subsidy issues, this is strictly an issue, as far as I can tell, of different ways of, and more efficient ways of tapping into the infrastructure, the subsurface.
Well, there are huge subsidies.
You asked a question about renewables.
That's not what's driving the revolution.
No, I'm not an expert in the energy area either, although I did have a stint back in the Carter administration at the Energy Department. But what I sense, actually, just someone, as an observer in Washington, is that the agenda for political priorities is very short, really, in all administrations, because the attention span and the capacity to manage moving forward major change is very limited. And one of the constraints on Washington, a more long-term, enduring one, is just competing priorities within the same party or within the same administration. That's a very big reality you have to contend with if you want to try to move through major change. My sense, as someone who sits in an office a few blocks from the White House, is that there's been a calculation in the administration that really bold progressive action on the energy front is too susceptible to Republican counterattacks, that you are disrespecting America's need for more jobs and trying to chase after these futuristic solutions that are going to cost too much now. They sort of overlook it may kill your grandchildren, and it may in the long term limit the growth of the country, but that, I think, is the calculation, so that we don't hear the White House and we don't see the kind of orchestration that can be done when the White House wants to make something a priority. So that I think, maybe as Al was suggesting, there are things happening in the economy and the business sector, happily, quite independent of what Washington decides. Because in a lot of ways, my own view on the economy, it's maybe a little different right now, where there's certain things that the government can really do to screw up the economy. But like my sense, when I was in the Clinton administration, is we were just damn lucky that the dot-com boom came along, and the presidents will take responsibility for things going well and then try to displace or avoid responsibility when they're not. But the notion that people were sitting around at the White House or in the Treasury Department saying, well, let's orchestrate this extraordinary economic boom, that's just poppycock. It's more, stuff happens and then you ride the wave and make the best of it.
But that's an interesting commentary in itself. If you listen to investment, the discussion here of investment was government investment. You just suggested that what really drove the economy was private investment and not the Treasury Department sitting around figuring out how the government can spend more money to invest to drive the economy. So I think, in a way, the concern here is you have the world flipped on its head.
Well, Jay, the problem, when I was talking about investment, I was talking about total investment. And a lot of investment and a lot of the misallocation of resources that Dick was talking about is driven by the same kind of government policies that I was talking about when I responded to the question that Haven raised. The fact is that if you look at the amount of investment, there's been a lot of investment in a lot of stuff. A lot of those decisions are driven by government policies or are the result of government investment. Public infrastructure, for example, and education, which have traditionally been two areas of public investment. Local governments existed for roads and bridges and schools. That was where they came from. What we haven't done is we haven't done two things. We haven't invested directly the way we used to invest. So we've got these huge due bills. Deferred maintenance is out of control. And we haven't made the right kinds of policy decisions that have encouraged private investment in those sectors. Nobody is going out, for example, in the private sector to rebuild our electric grid, our transmission system, which is rising to be our biggest vulnerability in America.
I'll give you an example.
The energy industry is driving investment, but the question was raised, why don't we invest in alternative energies? The real issue was it's natural gas, fracking, and a whole range of maybe traditional energy that is driving this boom, but maybe if we regulate it, we could kill it.
Well,
no, we're not suggesting that we regulate it to kill it. On the contrary, government policy should be aimed at providing the right governance so that those industries can thrive. Government should get out of the way to let those industries thrive. But where there are things that economists call externalities, where their thriving is at the expense of somebody else, that's where there's an issue. Now, what Elliot's talking about is, you know, investment in infrastructure. There is no reason why we can't have public-private partnerships that invest in our infrastructure. In fact, one of the roles that government can play, where you can't marshal the funds to look far enough ahead in private industry, because part of the problem is, Tom was talking about short-sightedness in government for political reasons, but the fact is that the classic infrastructure problem is sometimes the benefits don't appear for a decade after the investment is made.
Right.
And you know, as a result, if government can help marshal the public-private partnership that can invest in that infrastructure and provide some of that seed capital for financing, then that might be the catalyst to get private capital to come in and work alongside the government. That's a new idea that, you know, is something that we ought to take
I mean,
advantage of.
the other thing is, and to your point, you know, the 30 years ago or more, when we deregulated oil and gas prices, that was, if we hadn't deregulated oil and gas prices, we wouldn't have the production of natural gas that we're having in the United States today. And yeah, you got to get out of the way. Government has always subsidized new energy industries and initiatives. We subsidized oil and gas for years. We subsidized nuclear, with the biggest subsidies went to nuclear power. And what's happening now in solar and wind is it's being driven not so much by the tax credit, federal tax credit. It's being driven by states that are making judgments about renewable energy renewable energy requirements for generation. You know, and you can argue that both ways. Is that good or bad? But that's what's driving it more than, I think, tax credits right now.
Well, you built more transmission in New England than any other place.
Yeah, I know it. Don't.
So we got the most investment in
No,
than any other place.
Yeah, and we just invested another $3 billion. I mean, I happen to be a proponent of distributed generation.
We have about 5 minutes, maybe 4 minutes left. Yes.
I want to ask a question about the future. When we graduated, many of us were attracted into public service. And I was at the Federal Reserve and was at the Clinton administration when Tommy was there. But I don't think that there is the same level of enthusiasm, commitment to the idea that public service, working for the government, can help you change the world for the better. I see a lot of young people going into NGOs, into other organizations, where, looking from a longer term perspective, there's a hazier line of accountability in terms of the measurement and evaluation of impact of what they're doing. Clearly, in the military, you have a very clear evaluation of impact. And you also have a situation where you're not asked to be responsible for what you don't have control of. What I want to know is, how can we have an accountability structure, set of incentives within the government service that will attract the most talented young people, or a range of talented, we need to have talented people throughout in the private sector and everywhere. But we don't want to have the least talented in the government. And I think that what's going on, especially with what happened last week, and I have some government contracts and work with people who are in government agencies, and it's very discouraging. And I've already seen several of them leave. They took the 2 weeks to get their resumes out. And so what can we do as a country to make the public service that will attract talent and keep it for a while.
Why did it attract you?
How did it attract?
Why were you attracted?
Well, many of my classmates became lawyers because they thought that was the way to change the law, to make the infrastructure better, the rules, change the rules. And I eventually became an economist, not directly. I worked in Africa first and taught school in New York City, but eventually ended up in economics at the Federal Reserve, where we worked also. Because when I was a teacher, we always felt constrained by resources. And so I wanted to be in that part of the world that helped to make sure that there were resources for production. And the Federal Reserve seemed to be a good place for that. And I was interested in foreign countries and doing country risk analysis at the Federal Reserve. It's one of the best ways of understanding that, because you're looking at governance, you're looking at resources, you're looking at economic management, and it helps you to understand how everything fits together. And it has been a very, very rewarding, intellectually rewarding career. And of course, I encourage young people to do that. Now, one of the problems that I see, number one is, you probably noticed there are not many American economists. Well, you're an economist, you know. When you attempt to recruit at the top schools in this country, there are very few Americans. And our skills in mathematics now lag so far behind those of other countries that Americans are not being admitted. So I spend part of my time volunteering with the Industrial Project to get young people interested. But I think the issue of incentive structure and paying people for doing a good job and giving them some responsibility to do that job goes to the teachers in the classroom too. I mean, you may be concerned about Massachusetts teachers, but Massachusetts is #1 in the country.
I find that hard to believe, actually.
And so you understand the relative pain that we are in other parts of the country.
I have to say my wife was a teacher in Boston for 36 years. And we marvel when we hear for the last 2 or 3 years, and this was because of our own state standard set up about 20 years ago, that Massachusetts ranks that highly. You say, how could this be when we are seeing the public schools in Newton and elsewhere? God help us, what's going on in the rest of the country.
That's
true. I mean, it's true. And then when you take it to the international level, we all drop way down.
Well, Lean, I think you ask a very hard question, and I think there are a number of factors that contribute to this problem about how you're going to attract the best and the brightest to government service that I think are very different from our times. I know when the current Attorney General is an old friend, and I would introduce him sometimes at things. This is before he actually joined our firm. And I would say, he's been in private practice. This was a kind of self-conscious, 60s person saying. He's been in public service his whole career, whereas some of us went to these big firms and did this or that. And to sort of deflate that balloon, Eric would get up and say, or he got up and said, well, when he got out of law school, the difference between starting as an associate at Steptoe & Johnson, a Washington law firm, and going to the Justice Department Honors Program was $17,000 versus $16,500. And no debt. Now we have huge debt. This is in the legal profession anyway, and now it's $40,000 or $50,000 versus $160,000. So I think and also I think we've both on the Republican and Democratic side, it's become fairly popular to either demonize or disparage government employees. I don't know if you've heard about that poll where if you refer to them as bureaucrats, it's like 70% of people don't like them. If you actually call them government employees, it's much more, the reaction is much more positive. But I remember in the Clinton administration, a lot of that was going on both sides of the aisle. And you know what it took to actually sort of alter the public's view of government workers? No, it was Oklahoma City. So these are real people. Have children, and they're there trying to do something for you.
That's what settled the Bark strike last
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's huge. As I said, I think we need to get the debt down so that people, have more flexibility. I think we need political leaders who are not afraid to try to provide leadership to foster respect and appreciation for government employees, which, the consultants don't seem to think that's where it's at these days. But it's a very serious problem. Because one of the things I found as an appointee, one of the curious things about Washington is you don't actually have to have substantive expertise in very high-level positions. It is actually sort of more important who you know. And also there's a whole staff waiting there to, if you can't figure stuff out, they can tell you. Although it's a little dangerous in terms of who's leading then. But one of the things you found is that there are tremendously bright people in government, but a lot of them are also our generation. And you wonder whether the people who graduated at the top of their class and just said, I don't really want to do a big firm. I'm going to the Labor Department, I'm going to the Justice Department. You really worry about the proportions of the best and the brightest who are making the choice to go into government.
Dick, can I just add one quick point? You get what you pay for. I mean, if we don't pay them enough, they're not going to come. And secondly, whether it's a state group of teachers or whether it's public employees, if you turn them into a craft guild by having no incentives, by having no performance measurement, by really stripping all of the professional elements of a profession or government service away, people aren't going to be drawn to it. And right now, in most states and in the federal government, there's really the incentives to perform beyond those that come from your heart are not, I think, as sufficient as they ought to be.
It's also about leadership, Willeen. When I came back to public service, one of the reasons I came back is that the guy who's running the agency that I now work for, Tim Geithner, I think brought back to the organization a luster that had been lost in the prior 2 decades and made it a cool and consequential place to work and worked hard to make sure that the incentives, he was obviously constrained by the government pay schedule, but made it possible for people to have exciting careers and have responsibility at very young ages. One of the people I work with, one of the most talented people I know, went to school here, graduated in 2002. His father and I are the same age. His father was president of Amherst. His name is Amias Garrity. And, I told Amias the other day that my wife and I celebrated our 33rd wedding anniversary. And he said, that's pretty cool. I just celebrated my 33rd birthday. So there are young people in government who are attracted to it and who are very talented.
Again, and this is where I'll disagree with you, Tom, because I think that there was leadership and excellence in the Clinton administration, so it wasn't all luck.
No, I agree with that.
And working in Treasury where the lineup was reporting to Geithner and then Summers, there was clear instruction that when you're discussing an economic issue, that everyone contributed to the discussion. That's right. And the soundest solution was the one that was going to be put forward.
Right.
And that meant that there was an enormous focus and energy going into determining, in my case, it was policies and loans and projects at the African Development Bank. But there was a very high level of performance expected and respected. And yes, that comes from leadership, but it's that whole professionalism. You're going to take responsibility for what you're doing. That's right. And you're contributing.
Thank you all for coming. It's been really exciting. Thank you, guys.